Hey everyone, today I'm going to go through a game between Bobby Fischer and Bent Larsen, played in the year 1958, which Bobby Fischer actually dubbed in his 60 memorable games as Slaying the Dragon. So this game was played in Portoroz in 1958. Bobby Fischer was playing with the white pieces and Bent Larsen was playing with black. And the reason it's called Slaying the Dragon is because Larsen plays the dragon variation in the Sicilian, and Bobby Fischer meets it with his Yugoslav Attack. So play began with 1e4 from Bobby Fischer. Larsen played c5, the Sicilian, and then Bobby played knight to f3, and there was d6, d4, takes, and knight to f6, attacking e4. So Fischer defended with knight to c3, and now Bent Larsen played g6, the Sicilian dragon. And Fischer actually wrote in his book that the dragon was easy to play against, and that white's attack against it almost plays itself. There was actually a quote from Fischer who actually said that all it takes to beat the dragon is to open up the h-file and just sack, and then mate. So let's just see how this game continues on then. So Fischer played bishop to e3, developing. Larsen played bishop g7, and Fischer now sets up his Yugoslav attack with f3. There was castles, queen d2, knight c6, and now bishop to c4, the Yugoslav attack. Basically the plan for white is to castle queenside, and then just launch a pawn storm, and as Fischer said, just sack and try and mate with the black king. Now typically here, black usually plays the move bishop to d7, which is more solid, and white usually castles queenside, and play can continue with rook c8, bishop to b3, and knight to e5. These are all the main moves, so it seems as though it's theory, and white usually continues with h4, knight to c4, captures, and then h5, knight takes h5, g4, and now knight to f6. And we're getting to a rather aggressive middle game. Now I've run this through the engine and they actually say that white is doing a lot better here, but in practice there's actually play for both sides here in this position. But if we go back to this game, the 1958 one, instead of playing bishop to d7, Larsen played knight takes d4 straight away, trading off the knights, and Fischer recaptured with the bishop. Larsen continued with bishop to e6. Fischer didn't want to take that because then it would open up the f-file, and black gets more centralised pawns with the possibility of playing e5, so Fischer retreated his bishop back to b3, and Larsen played queen to a5, and now Fischer castled queenside. And this is all very standard stuff at the moment, so black's going to attack on the queen side, and white will attack on the king side. Now typically here often black takes the bishop with bishop takes b3, and it's very important that if this happens, white captures with the c-pawn. If a takes b3, white comes under a lot of pressure after queen a1 check, forcing white to retreat their knight back, and then black can just play rook fc8. And black's got a great game from this position. We'll probably just leave the queen on a1 and just suffocate white's position. So if bishop takes b3, white usually takes with the c-pawn, and it's often said here that white gains a weak pawn structure in the endgame, but as Fischer quoted actually, he said that first though, black must survive the middle game. So some fighting talk there. So basically what he's saying is white's middle game position is so much better than black's here. I think basically what white is going to do is launch these two pawns up the board, and there's not much that black can do to stop him. And in the middle game, this structure here with these pawns, this pawn cluster, is actually quite strong to stop black's attack. But if we go back to the main game, instead of capturing on b3, Larsen now played b5, so getting on with his attack. Fischer defended, moved his king off the c-file to king to b1, and Larsen now played b4. And this is where Fischer has to be hyper aggressive. If he's timid here and plays a move like knight to e2, black can get a good game with bishop takes b3, c takes b3, and then rook f to d8. The point being now, if white plays g4, black can play rook ac8, and after h4, black has this nice move e5, just blunting the bishop on d4, scuppering white's attack. And after that, say g5, there can come knight takes e4 in this variation. After pawn takes the knight, black can follow up with pawn takes bishop, knight takes pawn, and then play d5, and black has subdued white's position and got a very good game, and will probably go on to win this type of position if you're a very strong player. So for this reason, after b4, white's got to be very aggressive with the knight, and he played knight to d5 from Fischer, which is an incredibly strong move. If black followed in with knight takes d5 here, white has bishop takes g7 with a very good game, because after the king takes on g7, pawn takes d5, suddenly the bishop has to move back, and white can now just play h4, and after h5 play rook to e1, and white's got a very nice game attacking this weak e7 pawn. Black will be forced to defend this, and then white can get the queen maybe into d4, maybe rook to e4 and double rooks here and play g4 at a later date. Also after knight takes d5 there is an intermezzo move here after bishop takes g7. Black could play knight c3 check first, but even so white can just take. After the king takes the bishop, c takes b4, the queen can go to b5, but then white can play this nice move now, a4, given by the computer, and it says that white has a really nice game. Basically, white will play queen d4 next, still defending their b4 pawn, and with a nice space advantage and an extra pawn. So after Fischer played knight to d5, Larsen captured it with the bishop, bishop takes d5 was played, and now Garry Kasparov said this was an error on Fischer's part. Fischer now took with the bishop. Kasparov said Fischer should have taken with the e-pawn. The point being is after, let's say, queen b5, white gets a good game with rook h to e1. If black continues their attack, a5, there's queen e2, a trade of queens, a4, and just bishop to c4, where white has the two bishops. The problem Kasparov had with Fischer's move, bishop takes d5, is that now black could have played knight takes d5, getting rid of the bishop pair. After bishop to g7 check, knight to c3, pawn takes knight, black has rook a to b8. Doesn't have to take the bishop straight away, because after c takes b4 here, queen takes b4, takes and rook takes, bishop to b2 and rook f to b8. This is actually given as a drawn position because basically white's going to move the king out of the way, black's going to take the bishop off on b2, and it's a rook and pawn endgame. However, quite interestingly, after bishop takes d5 was played in the game, so Larsen could have played knight takes d5 here, but Larsen's claim was that he was going to go for the win instead and didn't want to take the bishop off. So instead of actually taking the bishop off and playing the strongest move, Larsen played rook a to c8 here, allowing Fischer to keep the bishop on. So Fischer obliges and plays bishop to b3. He keeps his white squared bishop on, and Fischer said that as soon as he played this move he knew he was going to win the game, because basically now white's just controlling all the white squares and has a very good defensive piece as well. But Larsen thought he was doing better after rook c7. His point is that he was just going to launch the a-pawn and dislodge the bishop on b3. However, let's see what happens next. So Fischer now played h4, going in for the attack. If black tries to subdue this with h5, white's attack comes quite quick and play g4, takes, and then play h5. Point being, after pawn takes h5, f takes g4, pawn takes g4, and queen f4. Black's position is kind of collapsing here. The bishop can take on f6, followed by queen takes g4 and rook to g1. So after Fischer plays h4, Larsen gets their queen out of the way, queen b5 prepares the push of the a-pawn, and Fischer just continues without even playing g4, just plays h5 straight away. Again, the point is if pawn takes h5, there's g4, and if h takes g4, white's attack is very fast with rook to g1, sacking some pawns and opening up the lines against the black king. I think we'd all prefer to play white in this position. Similarly, if they go knight takes h5 instead, white has bishop takes g7. If knight takes g7, there's queen h6, threatening mate on h7. And if the king takes on g7, there's still g4, followed by queen h6 check. So white is doing incredibly well here. So back in the game, Larsen also has to just counter-attack here. He plays rook f to c8. Fischer continues his onslaught then, h takes g6. Larsen recaptured, h takes g6. And now Fischer just has to be a bit patient here. For instance, an impatient move here would be bishop takes f6, getting rid of the defender, because after bishop takes h6, some white players would now see stars and play queen h6, threatening to take on g6 because it's pinned by the bishop on b3. However, black can just play e6, and basically now white's attack is gone, because even after queen h7, king f8, there's nothing white can do, and next move black is just going to plonk their queen into e5 and start harassing white's king instead. So patience is the key in this position, and Fischer was patient. He just added another pawn into the attack and played g4. So he's going to try and dislodge the knight off f6 this way. Larsen continued then with a5, getting his own attack in. Fischer now played g5. And this is where it comes to a head, because now if Larsen continued his own attack with a4, g takes f6 just wins, because after a takes b3, f takes g7, pawn takes c2, white can now just play queen takes c2, because the rook on h1 is threatening checkmates on h8, and black's in a lost position and is at least a piece down here. So in the game, Larsen can't counter-attack anymore, he has to play knight to h5 to defend his position. And now next is a typical Fischer move. He sacks the exchange, gets rid of one of black's defenders, plays rook takes h5. If black continued here with bishop takes d4, there's a very nice move actually that white can play, which is rook to h6, which looks quite interesting. Threatening to play rook takes g6 because the f-pawn is pinned by the bishop. Bishop to g7, queen f4, threatening to take on f7, bishop takes h6, queen takes f7, king h8 and g takes h6. Queen e5 and then queen takes g6 is a very interesting position, where white sacked the exchange but has two pawns for the exchange. I just thought that was an interesting one because that was a computer variation. However, the Kasparov variation here was actually after bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, g takes the rook and g6. This looks quite interesting. And there's one move here that gives black some drawing chances. Basically black's got to get rid of this bishop on b3 because it's an incredibly powerful piece. So rook c4 actually draws the game here for black. Other moves in this position lose, let's say queen e5, there's g takes f7, king f8, and white gets a really nice game after queen g1, threatening mate on g8, so after queen g7, bishop e6, rook to b8 and queen to e3, white's threatening rook to g1 followed by rook to g8. And again, in this variation, white sacked the exchange, but has an incredibly powerful position. So that's what happens if bishop takes d4. But in the game, Larsen played g takes h5. He just captured the rook. And Fischer now continued with his attack, played g6, threatening to take on f7 with the pawn of the bishop. So Larsen now tries to shut up shop. He plays e5, trying to dislodge the bishop off d4. However, before moving the bishop, Fischer throws in a check, g takes f7, wins a pawn. Now if black tries to bail out here with rook takes f7, white can just play bishop to e3, and even after a4, just play bishop to e6. The rook on f7 is pinned by the bishop now attacks the rook on c8 as well. And even after rook c7, white gets a good game after queen takes d6, because at any point now white can recapture the exchange on f7, and actually has an extra pawn in this endgame. So instead of bailing out with the rook, Larsen played king to f8, and Fischer now just moved his bishop to e3, away from the pawn on e5, and now also maybe threatening bishop h6 ideas here, with the queen and bishop battery, and try and harass the black king. In the game though, Larsen now played d5. The point being, after e takes d5 by Fischer, he took the pawn on f7. But Fischer now has a passed pawn, and he plays d6, unleashing again the bishop on b3, which is hitting the rook. If rook takes f3 by Larsen here, Fischer could just play d7, and after a move like rook to d8, queen d6 is actually checkmate here. So this just shows how desperate black's position is all of a sudden. The rook's attacked, so he plays rook to f6 instead. But now Fischer finishes the job. He plays bishop g5, attacks the rook once again, but this time Larsen has to defend his position. He plays queen to b7. Fischer takes on f6, gains the exchange back, bishop takes is played, but now white has the extreme advantage of a passed pawn and just plays d7, attacks the rook, which is forced to go rook to d8, and now it's pretty much game over. In the game, Fischer played queen d6 and Larsen resigned the game. Queen h6 was much cleaner because this is checkmate in a few moves. For instance, bishop g7, queen d6 is checkmate. and even if king e7, queen h7, bishop g7, queen takes is also checkmate. However, in Fischer's final position, this just does the job, because even after, let's say, king to g7 here, there's rook to g1, and white will pick up the bishop on f6 and still be an extra piece up with probably mating chances in a few moves. So this was the first encounter between Bobby Fischer and Bent Larsen, and they had quite a good rivalry in the years to come. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this game. If you did, please do support the channel by liking, commenting or subscribing. I'll see you soon with another chess video. Thanks very much.